A Ring of Endless Light by Madeleine narrated by Madison Martinez. Grandfather's house is, to put it mildly, unusual. It used to be a stable, a real stable for real horses. When Grandfather bought it before he retired, he left up most of the stalls and hard bookcases built in them for all the hundreds and thousands of books he collected over the years and can't throw away, either because he's going to need to check something in one, or they might be useful for a grandchild or friend or neighbor. Leo, for instance, used Grandfather's library for most of his school papers. Grandfather's bedroom is the only real bedroom. Up in the loft there are half a dozen cots, and that's where we sleep. We'd never before spent more than 2 weeks at a time on the island, and it's always been special and a holy day and fun to sleep all together in a dormitory. This time it was different. We were there for a purpose, to be with Grandfather. Mother and Dad hadn't said anything about time limits, just that we'd stay as long as Grandfather needed us. And yet I knew that Dad had to be back in Thornhill right after Labor Day. Unlike John and Susie, I'm not scientifically inclined, but what came through to me, and it came through loud and clear, was that our Dr. Father did not think Grandfather would live through the summer. I could not imagine the world without Grandfather. At the same time, I found myself thinking totally selfishly that I wasn't sure I wanted to sleep in a dormitory for more than a couple of weeks. The older I grew, the more I needed times and places of privacy, or privacy, as Rob calls it, which sounds considerably more private than privacy, to write in my journal, to write and rewrite again, poems and stories, to try to find out not only who I am, but who everybody else is, and what it's all about. That night after Commander Rodney's funeral, up in my cot in the loft next to Rob's, I couldn't sleep. Rob was snoring softly. His allergies bothered him, not only when the pollen count is high in the autumn, but whenever he's deeply upset, and I knew that his snoring this night was not because of the pollen count. I thought of going down the loft ladder to ask Dad for an anti-hypnotism, but Rob was sound asleep and he wasn't wheezing. My urge to go to Dad was more for myself than for Rob. I put my hands behind my head and waited for the beam of the lighthouse to swing across the loft, touching each cot with its friendly light. My eyes were so awake they felt gritty. I wasn't quite sure why Commander Rodney's death hit me so hard. He was our good friend, but not so intertwined a part of our lives that things would never be the same again. The way they'd never be the same for Leo. And yet, in a way, when anyone dies, even someone you don't know, someone you read about in a newspaper, life never will be quite the same again. What was it, Grandfather said? If someone kills a butterfly, it could cause an earthquake in a galaxy a trillion light years away. From downstairs I heard the sound of Mother's guitar, and I knew that either Grandfather or Dad had asked her to sing for them. And maybe, for the four of us up in the loft, she started with a French song, one of my favorites. Les flies de Santa Malo ont les eunuchs I'd conclure de l'air. It was the Goldberg variations, but it worked, and I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. Well, not quite that late, because the full moon was pouring its light through the attic windows, and that was what woke me. The loft was filled with a pearly light, which almost drowned out the lighthouse beam. The words of the Verise Grandfather had painted on the wall were clearly visible. If thou couldst empty all thyself of self like to a shell dishabit, then might he find thee on the ocean shelf and say, this is not dead, and fill thee with himself instead. But thou art all repelled with very thou, and hast such shrewd activity, that when he comes, he says, this is enow unto itself, thou to where, better let it be, it is so small and full, there is no room for me. Sir Thomas Browne wrote those lines at the least 3 centuries ago. But they always made me think of Grandfather, empty of all the horrid things, and filled with gentleness and strength. As for me, I felt repellent with very me, full of confusions and questions for which there were no answers. Susie cried out in her sleep. John turned over, and the old springs of the cot squeaked, as though John had disturbed their rest. Then I looked at the cot on my left, and it was empty. I wasn't worried. Mr. Rochester, who slept at the foot of the loft ladder, would have let us know if anything was wrong. I heard the ladder creak, and Rob clambered up, trying to be quiet. I sat up and whispered, "Where have you been?" Rob sat on the edge of his cot, talking to Grandfather, not Mother and Dad, Grandfather. You shouldn't have disturbed him. He was awake. How do you know? He was reading. What did you talk to him about? Dying. Rob was only 7, still young enough to talk about things you don't talk about, especially to someone who's dying. But why don't you? If I had a fatal disease, I'd want people to talk to me about dying instead of getting embarrassed and pretending I was going to get well. We weren't pretending that Grandfather was going to get well, but we weren't talking about it. At least John and Susie and I were not to each other. Perhaps Mother and Dad were braver. As for Rob, he was Rob. Do Mother and Dad know you were up? They're asleep, only Grandfather. We'd better stop whispering, or we'll wake John and Susie. As I said that, John bounced, and his springs protested loudly. Rob gave me a hug and kissed me before getting into his cot. He hadn't done that in quite a while, and I missed it. Rob's so much younger than the rest of us that I've wanted him to go on being a baby, or at least a little boy forever. But of course he can't. I lay down. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't quite warm enough, with just a sheet, and a little too warm with the light, wet summer blanket. I pushed it halfway down and tried to relax, listening to the wind and the trees. The surf's slow pounding against the shore. That too was terrific. During vacations, Mother plugs the prelocator into a timer before she goes to bed. For those who drink coffee, otherwise, we're on our own. At Grandfather's, we fix our breakfasts in the kitchen and take them out on the porch unless the weather is bad. Our first day on the island this summer, John gave the big round table a fresh coat of white paint, and this morning it was set with deep blue mats and matching blue seersucker napkins we could just throw in the washing machine. The china was white with blue stripe around the edge. Some of it was chipped, so we didn't look like something out of House Beautiful, just cheerful and normal. Mother, Dad, Grandfather, John were all there before me. I heated up milk in the kitchen and took a big blue and white cup of calf und lait out to the porch with me. I said good morning and sat down between John and Grandfather. The sky was hazy, the kind of soft blue lavender haze that means a hot day, with clear skies later on, and perhaps a thunderstorm in the late afternoon or evening. Any plans for today, Vic? Mother asked.